Hello, readers. Welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about another comic. This one is a collaboration of two characters, simply titled Batman, Deadman, Death and Glory. Here is the comic cover, and this comic was written by James Robinson and illustrated by John Estes. Diving into an overview, originally published in 1996, this one-shot comic opens with Batman chasing the Joker through a clock tower before waking up to find himself holding a knife to an innocent woman's throat and not remembering where he is or how he got into this position. The plot and pacing of the story is essentially that Batman is working to solve the mystery of all of the events that unfolded within the missing 1 hour that he doesn't remember anything, and ultimately to clear his name from the crime scene in which he found himself. To give a quick rundown of the rest of the story, he is forced to use magic, something that Batman is not really a fan of. Generally, he doesn't really like magic. He's a man of logic and technology, but he uses magic to draw out the character of Deadman, who is essentially a ghost, to help him solve this mystery. Working together, Batman and Deadman find a man named Albert Yates, who is a drug addict dying from AIDS. Yates has been prophesized to be the second coming in his next reincarnation, and in order to prevent this, the devil has sent a malevolent spirit called the Clown to come and collect Yates's soul. Batman and Deadman work against time to protect Yates, clear Batman's name, and find a way to defeat the Clown. To give a rundown of some of the main characters in the story, firstly we have Batman. In this story, we see him on the run from the law, and the story is really written in a way that is returning to a more noir detective style of storytelling and not quite as much action adventure as you might see in a more modern Batman story. The second titular character is, of course, Deadman. Just to give a little bit of background on him, he was a former circus performer named Boston Brand, and he was murdered. But prior to retiring to the afterlife, he was tasked at finding his killer and stopping crime. He was granted additional special abilities by a goddess known as Ramakrishna. Next, we have a character called the Clown, who is essentially just the personification of evil and a vengeful spirit of someone who was actually a clown in their former life. This character really exists more as an archetype than a really well-rounded character. We also see Detective Gordon in this story. If you're familiar with any Batman stories really, then you probably know Detective Gordon. However, in this story, we see a slightly darker version of him. He's presented as unafraid to use lethal force, specifically against Batman, due to the circumstances in which Batman was found at the beginning of the story. And we even hear Gordon describing Batman's actions as unforgivable. So it puts Gordon's character in kind of an interesting place where, in a lot of ways, we take Batman back to some of his early stories, such as Batman Year One, or even something like The Dark Knight Returns, where the story really sets Batman against the police and they're completely separate entities instead of working together. And lastly, we have Albert Yates, who we kind of already discussed who he is and what his role in the story is. So now to go into some of the general themes of the story, the first point that I really noticed when I was reading was there seems to be somewhat of different stylistic choices presented through the art style. And at times it seemed intentional, but at other times I wasn't 100% sure. But it was really interesting to see some of the art, especially at the beginning of the story, to me seemed very much Art Deco or almost surrealist, with huge set pieces like the watchtower in which Batman and the Joker are fighting. Then the story has sections of it almost looks like watercolor or colored pencil, where it has this effect of very beautiful and detailed and controlled, but there's a fluidity to it. It doesn't have the super severe dark inking that so many people would usually think of with comic books and comic book style art. However, later in the story, we then get into what seems to be more of a almost traditional style comic book art style where it has more of the line work, outlines of characters, darker inking. It almost seems like a way to separate the story into different sections or highlight specific emotional or thematic elements. The second theme is with a character like Deadman, there's usually some sort of a religious undertone. So he got his abilities from this goddess Ramakrishna, who is similar to like a Hindu deity. But simultaneously, we have this character of Albert Yeats, who is supposedly the second coming of Christ, and the clown, who is a direct envoy of the devil. So we have these multiple religious ideologies and imagery and influence coming together into the story. One element I did notice with this specific theme was seemingly who are these deities choosing as their vessels. Take Boston Brand, for instance. In his past life as a mortal, he was a circus performer, he was a womanizer. Then we have a character like Albert Yeats, who is a drug addict dying of AIDS. And this again came out during the mid 90s, a time in which the world was still reeling and dealing with the HIV and AIDS epidemic of the late 80s. So, what I took from this is that the author is exemplifying the ideas of society's castaways are those who are most worthy of redemption, specifically through the lens of Christianity, but potentially as well through a lens of Hinduism through Boston Brand's character and Ramakrishna. Now to talk about some of the good and the bad elements of the story. So firstly, the art style. I really liked the art like 90% of the time in the story. There were just a couple of weird instances where it seemed like I couldn't tell if maybe there was a different artist working on it. Maybe they were working on a really tight deadline on certain pages. I think the main thing for me is I just couldn't always tell whether it was intentional or kind of what was going on. And as a reader, that can be a little bit distracting if it kind of is taking you out of the story and you're beginning to kind of question the author and artist's intentions. That's probably not a great thing. Number two, I thought that overall, really cool concept in terms of a cool team up of characters. Someone like Batman who's so serious and in so many ways is shaped by his very real ghosts of his parents, of his life he potentially could have had and doesn't. And so because of that, he takes on the guise of Batman versus someone who is literally a ghost, Boston Brand, Deadman, who is thinking about, in many ways, the same things as Bruce Wayne of his life that he lost. He actually lost his life. Bruce Wayne's kind of more the people in his life that he lost that affected him and made him who he is. I felt like the characters both had enough impact in the story that it felt like a true team up. It wasn't Batman owning the whole story and Deadman was just kind of there for like a marketing ploy. They both actually had meaningful, impactful moments in the story, and it felt like a true team up to me. So that was a really cool element. I haven't read a lot of team up stories in this way of like two characters, either major or minor, who team up. So pretty cool in that regard. So going into my final thoughts, I honestly thought it was a neat one shot story. Basically, what a one shot is, for anyone who doesn't know, it's where instead of having multiple issues of a comic, like if you're doing an extended run, you might have a story in 8 or 13 issues. But a one shot is basically just it's one issue. So it's kind of cool in that you're getting a encapsulated holistic story in a one shot, and usually the authors and artists are able to do things a little bit differently because it doesn't directly impact any sort of continuity or outside stories. It's usually just one thing. They do it to express whatever, and then it's done. In terms of recommending, I think if you're familiar with both of these characters, Batman and Deadman, definitely give it a shot. If you're looking to learn more about maybe one of these characters, give it a shot. There's some really cool ideas in it, and overall, really enjoyed it. But if it's not something that you're necessarily looking for, I don't know if it's a must read or anything that it again is gonna impact continuity in any way where you would like need to read it as a comics fan. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.